Let the glory of the Lord rise among us. Let the glory of the Lord.
This is the third part of a series. At some point, I'm probably going to do another book with this content. I wrote a book based on Carol Dweck's book, Mindset, talking about the mindsets of Christians in the church, how sometimes we come in with an inferior mindset or a superior mindset, and I named it Cognitive Spiritual Development. And Dale Jenkins said, if you'd name your book something different, people might buy them. And he said, you need to write a book called Lonnie Jones Talks About Mental Health. And I started that manuscript a couple of times. I got deep into it, and it felt like a textbook. It didn't flow well. It didn't seem very didactic. And so I just kind of eased it to the side and ended up writing a book called, it's a small book, called Grappling with Life, Controlling Your Inside Space. And it uses some principles for setting boundaries, and it's mainly for the competition jiu-jitsu crowd. I know a lot of those young people, and I'm friends with them. But as I've been thinking about this other book, I have done 4 of these seminars now where people have said, we want you to come to our church and talk about mental health or mental illness. And so as we talked about basically some descriptions, personality disorders, mood disorders, psychotic disorders, and then some interventions and some limit setting last week. And then tonight I wanted to touch just a little bit about addictions and maybe sexual identity stuff. There's a fascinating discussion in the addictions community that addiction is based on trauma. And it doesn't have to be big T trauma. It can be little t trauma. It doesn't mean something terrible had to happen. It's just kind of the way we interpret things. And a lot of the assumptions that we made for years and years and years about addiction have not proven to be valid. When John Gottman started writing about marriages, he basically did an empirical look at, are these things that we teach about marriage, can they be backed up scientifically? And they couldn't. We've been teaching marriage and family, at our universities based essentially what turns out to be chicken soup for the soul. And they're not really based in good, sound psychological principles. Well, the same thing is what we've kind of discovered when we talk about addictions or substance use disorders. And in my class that I teach for the police, we do a 40-hour certification for what we call a CIT officer. That's a specialty officer who, when the police get dispatched to a call where there's not a crime being committed, but you've got a person with an altered mental state, an AMS call. When the Washington Post came in and observed our class, they did not treat us favorably, by the way. A young lady named Miss Dreyer, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, basically painted our department in a pretty embarrassing light. What she failed to do as part of that class was understand that we were talking about a class where you go from interacting with people like this to interacting like this. I can show you that I get where you're coming from. Well, she observed a 16-hour class and missed that part. She didn't see what the class was actually teaching about. But as part of that class, in her article, she said that this was just an economic deal. You give a guy 51 hours of firearms training, and you give him a 16-hour refresher course on soft skills. Well, she missed the part that this was an introduction to the course, not the 40 hours we give this special team of officers, and then they have to have 24 hours of continuing education throughout their career. She failed to pick up on that part. Well, part of the thing that we do in the class, she said it basically that police officers are trained in firearms and not trained in soft skills because it's a financial thing. She's right. It's a financial thing. When you're dealing with somebody in your home or in your community and they have a pervasive mental illness, and this is how I introduce it to the police officers. Because police officers don't want to be social workers. Okay? That's not essentially what they're trained to do, but we're training them to be a little better at it. I said, imagine that you have a bear in your basement. And for however many years you've had a bear in your basement. Does having a bear in your basement change anything in your life? Shake your head this way. Every day is controlled by what? The bear. So you got to make sure the bear's not hungry. You got to make sure the bear's happy. What happens when the bear that you're used to living with in your basement gets in the kitchen? When people encounter a mental health crisis and they call 911, the bear's out of the basement. Police officers don't go to see a mental health issue when everything's normal and happy, because when things are normal and happy, the bear's in the basement. Now, it's an economic thing because it doesn't cost you anything to dial 911. You call your psychologist at 2 o'clock in the morning, that's if you call me outside office hours and I respond to it and meet you, I double my price. I didn't do that when I was a minister, but I do now. Okay? And so if you call HIMSI, Huntsville Emergency Medical Services Incorporated, and they transport you on the boo-boo bus, you write a check for that. It is an economic issue when the police have to deal with mental illness because it doesn't cost you anything to dial 911. And when you dial 911 because somebody's behaving in an erratic way and they have either immediate access or could gain access to something that is dangerous, when you dial 911, you get a paramedic, a fireman, or a cop. Guess who they send to all those? The cops. So yeah, Ms. Dreyer was right. It is an economic issue because it doesn't cost you anything to send a poor cop and get him this deep when the bear's out of the basement. So we teach them that you're getting called to something where nobody's breaking the law, but they could be dangerous to themselves, and if they can hurt themselves, they can hurt you. And we need these skills. Part of what we teach in that class is not just the mental illnesses and the personality disorders and the mood disorders and the psychoticism, but we add into that you're going to encounter people on a regular basis who self-medicate. You run into people on a regular basis who have substance use issues. Now, if you think about a person who's got something wrong with the organic part of their brain and the doctor says, I want you to take this medicine and some of the symptoms might go away. But we've got to check your blood work every 6 months for your liver. You're going to lose your libido and you're going to walk around like you're a zombie. Or you can take a little Xanax or smoke a little weed, get the same result and feel better. Most people who use drugs are comorbid with some type of mental illness. Does that make sense? Without sounding too cavalier about it. So when you start talking about why are people addicted or why do people have substance use disorders, a lot of the stuff that came out in the early part of it was it's absolutely a brain chemistry thing. We talk about dopamine. And that you give your body something and dopamine likes it, then your body says, we want more dopamine. That's why we like chocolate. That's why we like thrill rides. That's why we like comedy movies. That's why we like a lot of things. The problem with that theory is that brain chemistry plays a part, but it's not the only part. Okay? In a famous experiment called Rat Park. Rat Park was where the old experiment was you put a rat in a cage and you give him 2 water tubes. One is just water. One is water either laced with cocaine or laced with heroin. A rat in a cage with access to water and water laced with cocaine or heroin will drink the cocaine and heroin water till he dies. And you can repeat it till you run out of white rats. And a guy named Bruce Anderson came along and said, what if it's not about the cocaine water? What if it's about the cage? And so he builds this big cage and called it Rat Park. And he put wheels and tunnels and colored balls and cheese and chick rats and all kind of stuff in there. And then he put regular water and Coke water. And the rats in Rat Park do not, compulsively use the cocaine water. And no rats ever died from overdose. It's not the substance, it's the cage. And when people feel isolated, and people feel helpless, and people feel worthless, shame is the fear of loss of connection. If you really knew who I was, you wouldn't like me, you wouldn't hang out with me. And I can't tell you who I am, and I can't tell you my deep, dark thoughts, and I can't tell you my infirmities, and I can't tell you my weaknesses, and I can't tell you my secrets, because if you really knew me, you wouldn't like me, so I'm ashamed, and I'm not going to build a connection. Well, if I go into a room, no offense, wearing a mask, and I'm not talking about this mask, but a pretend person mask. If I go into a room wearing a mask, I assume everybody else in the room is wearing a mask. Right? Okay, those of you guys who are concealed carry people. What does every concealed carry person on the planet think everybody else is doing? Concealing a weapon. Okay, because you concealed carry people look for weapons on everybody else. All right? That's why it's stupid to open carry. You're wearing something that says, shoot me first if you start. Anyway, that was for free. So I go into a situation wearing a mask. I think everybody else is wearing a mask. So I can't be honest with you, and I assume you're not going to be honest with me. So what happens to my connections? I have zero. And since I can't bond with you, I'm going to bond with something. Drugs, coke, smack, weed, heroin, pornography, shopping. And so really when you start talking about people with substance use issues, they've got this worldview that says, I'm not connected and I don't belong. And it's not just brain chemistry. 80% of the young men in Vietnam were probably, 25% of the young men in Vietnam were probably using heroin on a daily basis. You get thrown into a jungle in a war that's not popular back home, and you can kill or be killed on any day. The psychologists were saying, hey, when these guys who are using heroin on a daily basis come back to the United States, we're going to have a heroin epidemic. 80% of those young men who returned to the United States never touched heroin again. The ones who didn't come home to families. They came home to divorces. They came home to people whose parents thought they were baby killers, and they were isolated from society. The guys who came and went to college and had families, they never touched it again. So the model that says brain chemistry is the only factor and is more powerful than our free will is just not a good model. When your grandmother has her hip replaced, they give her diamorphine in the hospital. That's medical grade heroin. You can't buy that on the street. But when Granny goes home from the hospital, is she a heroin freak? No, most of the little old ladies I know who've had hip replacements don't have a real big heroin problem. Okay? And so the idea that it's just brain chemistry is really false. Now, is brain chemistry a component? Yes. It's not the only component. It's not the determining factor. And so this idea that I'm an addict and I'm always going to be an addict is a false notion. The idea is, what is your trauma? What is your loss of connection? How have you responded to that? And so if we understand when somebody's using is a survival mechanism. I'm not making excuses for it, but it's a survival mechanism. And you can't put them in jail long enough. You can't take enough stuff away from them. And you can't punish them hard enough to make them stop, because it has a survival component to it. They're surviving a trauma. And every time any circumstance in life reminds them of those helpless, trapped, powerless feelings, they're going to return to their addiction. That's why addiction is so hard to break. And that's why it violates what I believe to be the rules of behaviorism. When my behavior costs me more than it costs you, I'll change my behavior. That's not true in addiction. Because if bad consequences stopped addictions, nobody would be addicted, because everybody who's addicted has bad consequences. But how many times have you seen somebody live in a perpetual cycle of dysfunction? Well, that's because they're responding to a trauma. In the old ways, we treated the fruit, not the root. And you understand the root, you don't have to worry about the fruit. I've got blueberry bushes at my house. What happens when you pick a blueberry? Another blueberry grows back. Makes the mockingbirds happy. Makes my wife very mad. But anyway, so when you pull these behaviors off people and you don't treat the root, the behaviors just show back up. You can quote unquote fix an addiction to heroin, and the guy will be addicted to gambling or addicted to shopping or addicted to porn. And the fruit just keeps repopulating, and it'll always populate until you eliminate the root. So understanding the root of addiction, that it's usually based in some trauma where somebody feels powerless, helpless, or they feel like that they are trapped. And then once you understand that, the way we interpret the things that happen in our lives becomes a master plan for how we behave and why we behave. I don't know of very many things that I see at my office as a therapist that I can't link to trauma. And so when somebody comes in and there's some level of dysfunction or there's some level of despair, I've quit asking what's wrong with you and I ask what happened to you. Because when something significant happens to us, it changes the way we see ourselves. It changes the way we see the person who did it. It changes our past. It changes our future. And sometimes it affects the way we see God. And so if we understand that some of the things that we see that look like mental illness are dysfunctional or maladaptive responses to trauma, it would change the way we deal with people who are giving us difficulties in life. I want to kind of do a case study. This is one of those things that you say, Lonnie, you're reading too much into that. But let's look at this. Look at Genesis, and we're going to fast forward some stuff. We're going to eventually read some verses out of chapter 43. But we're talking about the story of Joseph. Now, in the story of Joseph, you've got a couple of things that happen because of a misinterpretation of trauma. The first thing that happens is Joseph is the favorite son of a guy who has 12 sons, and Joseph's father gives him a multifaceted coat, a richly ornamented robe, a coat of many colors if you go to Vacation Bible School, or a coat with sleeves. That robe means something to Joseph. What does it mean? You're the favorite. Now, how does Joseph handle his newfound power? As they say on the John Boy and Billy radio program, not too good. Because he tells his brothers, I had a dream. Y'all had stuff. I had stuff. Your stuff bowed down to my stuff. I'm the stuff. And he walks around in this robe flaunting his status with his brothers. So much so that he begins to be a rat. And begins to tell on his brothers, hey, they were supposed to be doing this, but they were doing this. And he gets his brothers in trouble. Joseph never understood that snitches get stitches, okay? That's what we said when we were in school. He didn't understand that. So he's alienating himself from his brothers. And one day his dad says, hey, go check on your brothers. So he's going out to work in the field with his brothers. What does he wear? His richly ornamented robe. You think this kid's expected to do any farm work? You don't wear your richly ornamented robe to haul hay. I'm sorry. He does so little farm work that he gets lost on his own farm. He ends up wandering around in the field. A guy finds him. What you looking for? I'm looking for my brothers. How hard is it to lose 11 brothers? Well, I think they're over near Shechem. So he goes there. When they see him coming, what do they say? Here comes this dreamer. They put him in a pit. They take his robe and they sell him to the slave traders. First trauma. What do they tell their father when they get back to supper? Because you got 12 kids, supper's a big deal. So you end up at the supper table and you start counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. You're missing a kid. That's a big deal. What do they tell their dad? Well, we think that they tell him, hey, an animal. That's what they plan to tell him. Hey, an animal killed him. They don't tell him anything. They show him a coat dipped in goat's blood. And they say, do you recognize this? From the coat dipped in goat's blood, he says, this means my son is dead. It means he was torn by a wild animal. And it means I'll never be happy again. The Hebrew phrase is, I'll go to my grave mourning. If I start here and I mourn till I die, that means I'll never be happy again. He's taken an event, a bloody coat, and he's interpreted as he's dead, an animal tore him up, and I'll never be happy again. When we experience loss, grief, trauma, we get implicit beliefs. This is what this means in my life. These people mistreated me. I must be worthless. This guy sexually abused me. He must be all powerful and I must be powerless. My mom and dad divorced. It was probably my fault because they were arguing about my grades the night before they did it. And we take these things that happen and we give them implicit beliefs. Number one is the belief that Jacob had about his son valid. Is Joseph dead? Nope. Was he torn by an animal? And by the way, how does an animal eat you and not tear your coat up? I'm just saying, that's some straight up ninja stuff. Snatch you out of that coat, it floats to the ground. And did he have the capacity to be happy again? Yes, because experience is not what happens to you, but what you do with what happens to you. David Shannon, when he talks about a moralistic therapeutic deism, says that if A is what happens to you and C is your life, A does not equal C. A is what happens to you, B is what you do with it or how you respond to it, and C equals your life. A plus B equals C. A doesn't equal C, A plus B equals C. So you've got the dysfunction of their father who says, oh man, this is terrible. Because I see the blood on the coat and I make these assumptions. A lot of people make assumptions about what their lives mean, and it makes them walk an unhealthy path. If you're familiar with a compass, and I take my compass and I want to walk at a 0-degree heading, but for whatever reason my compass is damaged and it gives me a 1 degree. Does a 1 degree difference on my compass matter from here to the back door? Probably not. Does it matter from here to Huntsville? The further away you go, the wider that angle gets. Well, if you've had this belief in your life for 15 years, my dad abandoned us and didn't have anything to do with it, there must be something wrong with me. The longer you walk that path, time and distance equal the same in this scenario. You can end up really, really, really lost as a person if you take something that happened to you and you misinterpret it. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, the second part of this is when Joseph's brothers come to Egypt and run into him. Now, chances are he's unrecognizable. Number one, he was sold there when he was 17. I don't know how many years transpire. Enough years have transpired, he's got a wife and he's got 2 children. He probably rocking a shaved head. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but he's hanging out with the Egyptians, okay? And he's in an Egyptian costume. They don't even know he can speak Hebrew because they talk in his presence and he talks with a translator. Have you ever wondered why Joseph treats his brothers in such a weird way? I mean, did you notice that when his brothers come instead of going, hey, I'm Joseph, he plays this cat and mouse game with them. You ever wondered about that? I think it's weird behavior. Because I've been isolated from my brothers, and my brothers show up, I go, I'm alive. But he doesn't. He plays this, and this is the Lonnie Jones theory. This is opinion only. Number one, when he has his 2 sons, Ephraim, I think, means I've forgotten the trouble in my father's house. And Manasseh means I've become fruitful in the land of affliction. He's not happy to be in Egypt. See, for accommodative purposes, on Wednesday, I've got a multicolored coat. I'm the favored son. On Thursday, I'm a slave. And how many years has he been in Egypt and nobody came to check on him? He doesn't know his brothers went home and said, hey, he's dead. He didn't know his father came to the conclusion, my son been eaten by a lion. On Wednesday, he had a coat. On Thursday, he's a slave, and nobody comes looking for him. His brothers run back and forth to Egypt to buy grain like we go to Walmart. And nobody in 20 years has come looking for him. How do you think he's interpreted this whole thing? I go from being the favorite son with a special coat to I'm a slave. I get accused of sexual harassment. I end up in prison and finally ascend to the throne of Pharaoh. I really don't have any use for those people. You see how his trauma has affected him? Now, when his brothers first show up, he interviews them, and in one version, it's different than his brothers tell it. So read Genesis chapter 43. Now the famine was severe in the land, and it came to pass when they had eaten up the grain which they had brought from Egypt, their father said to them, go back and buy us a little more food. And Judah spoke to him, saying, the man solemnly warned us, saying, you shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you send our brother with us, we'll go down and buy you food. But if you will not send him, we will not go down, for the man said to us, you shall not see my face unless your brother's with you. And Israel said, why did you deal wrongfully with me and tell the man whether you had another brother? And they said, the man asked us pointedly about ourselves, about our family, saying, is your father still alive? And have you another brother? I'm sitting on the throne of Egypt. I'm in the second most powerful man in the world. And the guys who took my coat and threw me in a pit and sold me like a dog are standing in my throne room. Your dad's still alive? Yeah. You got another brother? Is he asking about Benjamin? Or is he asking about himself? Will these guys fess up to, yeah, we had another guy, but we sold him? Will they confess to the most powerful man in the world other than Pharaoh, yeah, this is how we behaved? But when he asks them, do you have another brother? They go, oh yeah, we got another Benjamin. I've got a blood brother. I've got a brother, no offense, it's not a step brother, he's not a half brother. That's when his plan develops. Well, the next time you come to buy food, you bring Benjamin with you. And you will not see my face again unless he's with you. Why? Well, Benjamin comes to Egypt, and what does he do? Hey, you take my gold cup, the one I use for divination, and you hide it in Benjamin's sack. When they go home, you pull them over, and you say, hey, we're missing some stuff from the palace, and we're going to search you. And they're going to say, hey, we didn't do anything, because they did, and I hid the cup in there myself, or you did, my servant did. Here's what you say to them. We're going to search your stuff, and the guy we find it with doesn't go to prison, doesn't get killed, becomes my slave forever. So you send these guys back, and you pull them over, and you say, hey, you stole my master's cup. No, we didn't steal your master's cup. We're going to search your stuff, and here's the deal. If we find it, the guy we find it with becomes mine. And they go, roger that. Benjamin's found with the cup. He gets drugged back to Egypt. Joseph says, look, I'm your real brother. These guys treating you bad like they treated me, let them all die. I've just adopted you. I think that's the plan. It's the only thing that makes sense to me. You don't have to agree with that. But when they find the cup in Benjamin's sack and they get back to Egypt, Benjamin doesn't come back by himself. They all come back. And Reuben says, look, you don't understand. I pledged my life for this boy. And if that boy goes back, look, his dad lost another son. And if he loses this son, he will come to pieces. Now Joseph knows about his father's grief. And he says, look, I pledged my life. Tell you what, let him go and you take me as a slave. And what happens? Joseph becomes so emotional, which is not typical for an Egyptian, that he runs everybody out of the room and reveals himself to his brothers. And instead of adopting one kid, he adopts 12. Actually, he adopts 75 people if you read the Septuagint. Because he says, you go get dad and everybody, your children and your wives, and y'all come back here. His plan, I believe, was to adopt Benjamin and get rid of everybody. But when he sees that his belief about who his brothers were, they've matured, they've changed, his plan changes. And instead of keeping Benjamin, he invites them all to come live with him. But do you see how the trauma of being sold into slavery and nobody ever come looking for you could have possibly directed the path of Joseph's life? So when bad things happen to us, that's the key. We've got to ask, number one, what does this mean to me? And number two, does it mean what I think it means? And understanding that the majority of our dysfunctions that aren't caused by trauma to the actual organ of the brain, or by something that's causing restricted blood flow or hormones or whatever, but dysfunctional behavior is probably linked in some way, shape, or form to something that's happened and I've interpreted in a different way. And I get into similar situations, I'll behave in the same way because the brain protects you from danger by taking the things that are similar and treats them as the same. If I get stung by a hornet, I'll dodge a housefly. If I'm scared of snakes, the water holes scare me to death when I'm raking leaves. If you get bit by a dog when you're 8, you know that dog died You know that's not even the same dog, but you're scared of most dogs. Why? Your brain says, hey, that's close enough. So when somebody's abusive to you, or somebody's dishonest with you, or somebody lies to you, or somebody rejects you, you live your life replaying that incident, and your survival mechanism causes you to respond to that. And that's how dysfunctional behavior begins, as a pattern, and it becomes as a compass heading that we walk for a long, long, long time. Does that make sense? So when we encounter people who have these dysfunctional behaviors, one of the things we need to do is understand where they're coming from. Now, last week we talked about limit setting, but in this situation, when you begin to talk about people, we need to try to offer them some understanding. We need to ask, what happened to you? And if we can ever demonstrate to another person that we understand their trauma, or we get their perspective in life, and this, I'm famous for doing this. Well, I've got a new one. When you're talking to somebody like this, if you can ever do this. When I do active listening, and you believe that I hear you, I understand you, and accept you, that means I show you empathy. We now have rapport, and people with rapport can influence the other person, and then you can lead them to behavioral change. That's what we teach in the de-escalation class. So when I run into somebody and they are capable of self-insight and self-regulation, and they're just operating on a deficit, that deficit probably comes from interpretation or misinterpretation of trauma, and my intervention with them is to let them see, hey, I get your pain, I get your feelings, I understand where you're coming from. I don't have to agree with it, I don't have to think it's valid, I just have to let them know that I get where they're coming from, and I can possibly intervene and help them. And that's the way we deal with people when and trauma and addiction are similar to each other, because some event or some belief sets us on a path, and that path vectors way, way off. And most people don't just have just one. There may be several, especially if they're early traumatized. Then they realize, or they believe, the world's a dangerous place, and everything begins to fall in place. Now, having talked about how we treat them, let's talk just a minute if the them is us. Your life is not defined by those things that have happened to you. And in the same way that our brain fills in the gaps and says, hey, this is similar, this is same. In the same way that your brain takes something that's similar and extrapolates and says, oh, this happened there, this happens there. Our brain does that all the time with some really interesting stuff. For instance, if I make this statement, in my truck is a candy bar. Your brain did something. Some of you know what my truck looks like, and you pictured a little black Toyota Tacoma. Some of you don't know what I drive, and you invented a truck. By the way, when I've asked audiences before about that, they think I drive a big, white, jacked-up truck. I guess it's because I'm short and they have compensation issues. I'm not sure. But, that's the popular truck for Lonnie, is a big, white. And so you invented a truck, or you pictured my truck, and then you also, in your mind, might have made up a fantasy candy bar. Anybody picture candy? Snickers, Butterfinger, Twix bar, yeah. And then, not on a conscious level, but on an unconscious level, you went, if I could go out there and get in his truck, I could eat that candy bar. Now, because I'm in Winchester, Tennessee, and I can see out the back door, I'm almost 95% convinced my truck's out there. 70% chance there's snacks in my truck. And if you could get in it, you could have them, okay? That's just what our brain does. In my past, and your brain did the same thing. You brought that thing up that hurt you, scared you, disappointed you, changed you, shaped you, bothers you, makes you feel guilty, makes you feel less. "95% guaranteed my truck's out there. 100% guaranteed your past is not out there. And you could walk from here to Huntsville and not find your past. And although you could get into my truck and eat candy, you can't get out there and do anything with your past. So for all practical purposes, your past does not exist. Quit living in it. Quit letting it define you. Quit letting it tell you who you are. Let it tell you how worth you are. Quit letting it tell you what God is about you. Stop living in your past. One of the most empowering verses comes from the Psalms. And the psalmist says, as far as the east is from the west, He has put our transgressions from us. I think that's really interesting. Really cool phraseology. As far as the east is from the west. As an amateur rock climber, you try to find rocks nobody else has climbed. You get a topographical map. You hear people talk about, there was this talk around Huntsville. Candle stand, candle stand, candle stand, candle stand. I realized candle stand was this rock formation associated with a piece of land trust property. And technically it was trespassing when I went to find candle stand. And it's no big deal. It wasn't worth the trespassing. It wasn't worth the walk over there. But you find out about where a place is to climb. And if you've ever tried to find directions to an obscure rock formation, especially if you ask them from a farmer, that's just bad. We were trying to find a place in Tennessee, no offense to the residents here, but we pulled up and asked this guy. He goes, yeah, you go down there and a ways and you turn where they cut that tree down last year. Now, I'm not from here, so I don't know where the tree was last year, but it didn't seem to bother him. As you go down there where they cut that tree down last year and you pass the new chicken house. And I asked him, how can I tell the new chicken house from an old chicken house? He said, the age of the chickens, dummy. So, apparently we weren't talking on the same frequency. So we left him alone and talked to another guy. He stuck his thumb in the galluses of his overalls and said, I don't believe you can get there from here. Now, I'm suspicious of that construct. I think you can get there from here in most circumstances, right? What is the guy said? I had a friend who was believed in a flat earth, and I told him to go walking, and he came around. Anyway, all right, so as far as the east is from the west, God has removed our past from us. So if I take a globe and I put my finger on Winchester, Tennessee, and I start going north on that globe, at some point I'll start going south. Isn't that cool? And if I put my finger on a globe in Winchester, Tennessee, and I start going south, at some point I'm going to go north. But if you put your finger on a globe and you start moving east, you will always move east. Your compass will always read east as long as you're walking east. You've got to turn around to go west. You can't walk from the east to the west. It's always east. I took your past, your sin, your guilt, your trauma, your abuse, whatever, and I put it as far away as the east is from the west. And God says, you can't get there from here. That's how far away your past is. That's how far away the abandonment was. That's how far away the divorce was. That's how far away all these things are that we let define us rather than our identity being as redeemed people in Christ. As far as the east is from the west, I've removed your transgressions from you. God is the God that says you don't live in the past. God is the God that says you live in the future. Because we are told over and over and over, the formula for surviving life's traumas is not looking in the past, but looking for the future. Read Romans 8. Read Hebrews 12. I do not count the things that are happening here to even be worth comparing to what's going to happen. Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despised the shame, is now sitting at the right hand of God. The way we deal with life's difficulties is to have a future focus. Not the focus of the past, because you can't get there from here. It's as far away as the east is from the west. But the promise of salvation, the promise of Christianity, is that if we look forward to what God has promised us, then the circumstances of this planet really, really should not matter as much as they do. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean it's going to be quick. It doesn't mean it's going to be fun. It doesn't mean it's going to be joyful. What it says is you don't have to focus on this existence. And if the devil can get us to focus on the here and the now, he wins. If the things that can happen to this insubstantial piece of clay that is a vehicle for my soul can get me distracted from the fact that I am a soul. See, you don't have a soul. You are a soul. When you die, you don't become a spirit. You've always been a spirit. You drive around in this thing for a little while and get rid of it and you go home. If we ever get distracted by the things that happen to this thing or this thing, and it lets us say bad things about God or not believe in the inherent self-worth that God gives us, if we fall for that lie, then there we truly are dysfunctional in our thinking. And that's not about mental illness, that's about spiritual illness. And the spiritual illness of sin and letting our past mistakes or the mistakes that people have done because they were evil define who we are and what we're worth. Hebrews chapter 11 talks about faith and circumstances. And it's interesting that if you read Hebrews chapter 11, you get these superhero comic book endings. They shut the mouths of lions. They quenched the violence of the fire. They survived the flood waters. They ran off armies of aliens. They had their dead raised to life. And the next verse says they were tortured. They were sawn in half. They were kept in dungeons. They wouldn't get deliverance. They lived in caves and holes and walked around in sheepskins and goatskins. Hebrews chapter 11 is about people of faith. These people had faith and had these superhero endings. These people had faith and had horror story endings. You know what that tells me? Your faith does not affect your circumstances. If you have bad circumstances, doesn't mean you have weak faith. The message of the letter to the Hebrews is, don't let your circumstances affect your faith. Whether you've got an illness or you're living with somebody with an illness, that is not a statement on your worth or your value to God. It's a statement on the difficulty you have enduring this life for a very little amount of time. And if we can ever focus on the future hope and the future glory, then the insubstantial, transitory things that happen to our bodies and happen to our minds and are done to us should not be the focus of our lives. I'm not trying to minimize anybody's trauma. I'm not trying to minimize anybody's illness. But I'm telling you, 70 years of anything is incomparable to eternity with God. If the devil can ever discourage us and discomfort us and isolate us because of those things, he wins the battle. But if we ever understand that the promise of God is that regardless of what happens in this life, this is not the only life. There's more out there. And we have an eternity. And that's why I think the Christian should approach mental illness or mental health in a very, very different way. If we're dealing with those people who suffer from those things, we need to have care, concern, and compassion. If they are toxic, we need to have care, concern, compassion, and appropriate limits. If we're dealing with those things, we need to find out, is it something organic or is it something that we've interpreted and we're dysfunctional either because of trauma or because of an interpretation error. And then if we have the capacity for self-insight and self-regulation, that self-regulation says we're accountable to God. And if we'll give our lives to God, God will redeem us, God will save us. And eternity with God can't even be compared to 70 or 80 years of difficulty here. I hope this has been a beneficial seminar. I hope it's been something that is practical. I hope it's something that is usable. And I thank you guys for letting me come and share it with you. Let's pray together.